Brennan Lamey, welcome to the What Kind of Internet Do You Want podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you today. And usually I begin by asking my guests their background, but I just listened to another interview that you gave. And I know that your background, that you're pretty new, that you recently dropped out of USC to get into crypto, and that you previously had a lawn maintenance type of business. I don't know what that's called, like yard
Yeah,
work.
it was like excavation and stuff like that, and like irrigation things like
Okay,
that.
okay, and you had
Not related
15
to crypto.
employees, which just shows that you're, like, this incredibly industrious, hardworking person, and you were on a track to have, like, a really good life. You were doing mechanical engineering at USC, so it could have been, like, could have made good money, you had done interesting things, but you dropped out to get into crypto, and I just think that that's really interesting, and I would love to know why. What made you, take the leap into the unknown and kind of do the harder thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of reasons. I think it can probably be boiled down to interest and ethos. So one, I'm very interested in computer science. I started studying mechanical engineering because I was good at physics. But I really fell in love with computer science, particularly like during COVID. I mean, I started coding before that, but it was during COVID that I really got into it and got deep in it. And so I kind of wanted to do something in computers, and my passions just sort of led me towards Kwil, which was not what I was studying. And then ethos wise, I very much agree with the Web3 ethos, which is building a freer, fairer internet, an internet where these same rights that are guaranteed to us in Western societies are also guaranteed to you in digital spaces. And so I think the combination of those two things, it made it pretty easy for me to say, all right, I can put this whole college thing on hold, and I can see if I can make something out of Web3.
Interesting. I love it. I love that the ethos aspect in particular. We definitely share that. I come to it from a slightly different perspective in that I was a creator, is what they call it now, and really interested in how to put my work out in the world, interested in new forms of work, interested in experimentation that way, and disturbed by what's happening on Web 2 in terms of deplatforming, demonetization, censorship, those types of issues. So um, great. I'm really glad that you are here and that you're working on Kwil. So before we get into the details of Kwil, let's just talk about what you think about Web3. How is it different than the web that we have today? What's your sort of vision for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there. I think this is a broad statement, but I would say broadly, Web3, it's public infrastructure for the digital age. The majority of how we live our lives is on private infrastructure, and that's even true for this podcast. Actually, we're using Zencaster. Zencaster is a company.
Hmm.
If Zencaster went under, or you stopped, paying Zencaster, or if they changed the rules, all of a sudden you cannot use Zencaster. And as we're spending more of our time online and in digital places, I think it's important that those digital places give us the same guarantees as physical places. And so Web3, if you're using a Web3 podcasting platform, there wouldn't be a way for it to kick you off. Or if there was a way for it to kick you off, it would be defined ahead of time. And
Hmm.
so you wouldn't have to worry about the rules changing out from under you, which is, I would say, generally true for Western societies and the laws that apply there. And so that is kind of, I think,
At least
why.
it's what we aspire to be true. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
that's
exactly, right.
really, really well said. That's really beautiful. Okay.
Thank
Yeah, I like that a lot. It makes me think too about how, infrastructure. I say that infrastructure is the foundation of prosperity, and that at the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. really invested in its infrastructure, in the roadways and the railways and the waterways and the even the sewers are an important part of our infrastructure. And the infrastructure of the web today has been primarily built at this point by private companies. And that now we're talking about changing that to be this public good, this infrastructure that supports us all. And so I totally agree with you. What was it you said at the beginning? It's the public infrastructure for the digital age.
I think so. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, that was great. I love
honestly,
that.
yeah.
Okay, so now let's dive into how Kwil works at a high level without the technical jargon. Explain it to somebody who maybe understands Bitcoin and wants to know more about Web3 infrastructure.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess we'll start with Bitcoin. Actually, it's a distributed ledger. So you have wallets on this distributed ledger. There is it's a a string of characters, a set of characters, and there are some cryptographic proofs that you can use that essentially identify those to you. So if you send me Bitcoin on Bitcoin, the entire Bitcoin network can see that the string of characters, or one of the strings of characters that is representative of you, sent money to the string of characters that is representative of me. Or it's not actually representative, but uh, not a perfect analogy, trying to keep a high level.
Yeah,
And
totally
so,
fine.
yeah, how that works is that like it will, well, okay, this is true for Ethereum, not quite for Bitcoin, but won't go too deep into it. But essentially, it is keeping a record that you sent me that thing, and somebody can go and find that record later and see that you sent me that money, and therefore I have that money. And so at its core, all it's doing is replicating data across all of these machines. All of the machines in the Bitcoin network would have that information that you just sent me money. And so we take that same concept, but we also include some more traditional and I would say some more commonly useful ways in which data is managed digitally. And so this gets to what we call the relational model, which is a way of viewing and thinking about data in tables. And so this is actually pretty intuitive to people now. You can think like an Excel spreadsheet. Data is stored in tables. There's rows and there's columns, and it's a very intuitive way of organizing data. Well, there is a corollary for that in traditional data storage called relational databases, and it stores data for applications in tables like an Excel spreadsheet, just a little bit more scalable. And there's all these interesting things you can do with that data. So you can cut it up and you can divide it and you can merge different tables together, and it one makes it really easy to pull out valuable information from these data storage systems, but two, it's really efficient at sifting through all this data and doing all these different combinations on it. And so we have brought that concept, which is extraordinarily common in just like traditional Web 2 data storage, and we are bringing that to Web 3. So just like how Bitcoin is replicating the information of you sending me money, or Ethereum is replicating smart contract data, we are replicating this tabular data that's stored in tables. Does that make sense? Was that a good way of describing it, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good. So for the technical people, give us a little bit more of the details of how that happens. Are you storing all this data on chain?
Yes. So, kind of, and that's a very interesting question. So we this sort of gets to why you would actually want to do this. Why would you want to store data in a system like Kwil over a system like Ethereum? Because
Hmm.
if you just took a singular piece of data, let's say uh, information about a person, you could store that anywhere. And so there's sort of trade-offs for why you'd want to store it on Quill over, storing it on Ethereum, or storing it just directly on Arweave, or really anywhere else. And so, sort of the approach that we are taking is that it's a bit more of a federated approach. I think
Okay.
some common examples of projects, infrastructure projects that have taken an approach similar to this might be projects like Farcaster. So Farcaster, are you familiar with Farcaster?
I've heard of it. Is it like a podcasting platform?
No, so it's a decentralized social media, kind of like Twitter. Uh,
Okay. Okay.
So if we think of on-chain, on something like Ethereum,
Mhm.
where all of the nodes are replicating this data,
Mhm.
the reverse side of that might be IPFS, where there
Mhm.
isn't any guarantee that all the nodes are replicating this data. They can, but there's no guarantee.
Right.
And so we can actually sort of think of that like a spectrum, and Quill is sort of in the middle of that spectrum. So when you're storing data on Quill, it's not getting replicated on all of the nodes on the network. But if you had a database, let's say you're building the decentralized podcasting platform, and you have a
Mhm.
database on Quill that is storing that data. That might be replicated on 8 or 10 or 20 nodes. It's sort of configurable, but that can be replicated on a certain amount of nodes, and
Okay.
you get guarantees. And the guarantees do sort of shift. If you're replicating on 1 versus 3 versus 100 nodes, but yeah, you can choose how often this data is replicated, and there are some interesting caveats with the guarantees you get for that replication. Does that make sense?
It does. It
Okay.
definitely makes sense. I got into Web3 working on a project that was originally known as the Decentralized Library of Alexandria. And a component of it that we thought about was what you're talking about right now, which is how to incentivize a certain number of, if you're talking about BitTorrent, they're seeders, if you're talking about IPFS, they're pinners, but how a certain amount, a number for the swarm that's hosting that file, and then how that happens kind of ongoingly. So is that what you're talking about, is the approach to making sure that there are always pinners of that data or replicating that data? Is it like if I stop paying, will they stop replicating it?
Yeah. So yes. Now
Okay.
it's not a perfect analogy for databases because there are some concerns that happen with databases that don't occur with IPFS. The
Mhm.
big one being, I guess I'll give an example. You could build a marketplace on Ethereum where you are selling shoes, right? And if I had one pair of shoes to sell, and both you and another person wanted to buy that pair of shoes, we'll be able to see on Ethereum who got it and who did not, and in
Mhm.
a pretty short period of time, because all of the nodes are agreeing on this, and they are incentivized to agree on spreading this data in a certain amount of time. That doesn't exist on IPFS. You could not build that on IPFS because it might be a year before these nodes sync their data with each other and see, oh, it was actually Amy that bought the shoes and not Devin. And so Kwil, like the other sort of caveat, is that we do have some of those concerns that a network like Ethereum has, where time to spread that data and replicate it is important. And so that's sort of the other caveat that makes this not quite like something like IPFS or like what you described, the Library of Alexandria.
So does Quill work with Arweave exclusively, or does it work with other kinds of file storage protocols, like, I guess maybe not IPFS, but SIA storage, those kinds?
No, so we don't. It really so the unlock of Quill on Arweave. This is really interesting. The Quill network is actually managing storing the data itself and keeping the most recent version of that data up to date. But what is really valuable for a lot of Quill databases is the ability to have a permanently stored history of everything that ever happened to that
Okay.
database.
Yeah, that's what is
Um,
cool about Arweave for sure.
yeah. And
Mhm.
the issue of trying to do that on something like SIA or Storj or Filecoin or anything that is not Arweave is that you have to perpetually pay to store that data. And that's
Mhm.
actually really hard to build incentives for because that data
Mhm.
is always growing. But with Arweave, once we have some change in the data, we can log that in Arweave. And as long as you pay for it once, you can be sure that you're going to have that for the rest of time. And so you certainly could build it on Filecoin or Storj or SIA or anything else. But the key unlock of Arweave is that you pay once and it's stored forever. That's really what makes it valuable for a database like Quill.
That completely makes sense. We love Arweave for that same reason, having played with a bunch of these different file storage. We started so long ago that IPFS didn't exist. We used BitTorrent in our first version of the build. So, I mean, the thing about Arweave keeping the data forever is just like it's the best. And the way that they've gone about it is super smart. I'll just recommend that for any viewers out there. If you want to look into that or know more, we have some videos about Arweave. I spoke with Sam, so you can check those videos out too. Um, so the Quill network stores the database data, but some parts of it are then permanently stored in Arweave. Are you storing just like hashes? What are you storing into Arweave?
So you can really choose. Now, I think what is common is that all of it gets stored. So we can sort of think of I'm trying to think. Your viewers wouldn't be familiar with like the concept of like state, like an application state, right? Um, I, I,
Sure,
I I can keep it higher level. So
that's okay.
we have we have some a database and a Quill database, and you can add to this, you can update records in that, you can delete records from that. Let's say it's a users database. We're tracking the users for our decentralized podcasting platform, and a new user comes and creates a record in that database. So they come in, they register on that platform, and they're now a member of that platform. So that will insert a new row into a table that is representative of those users. But at some point in the future, they might change something about themselves. They might change their name. They might change their age. They might delete their account, so that's not there anymore. And so what gets stored on Arweave is that they made those changes. So in Kwil, it's keeping the the active, we call it the view, the current view of that data. So if somebody deleted their user, then it's no longer there. But on Arweave, you'd be able to go see, okay, this person at this point in time, they created a user, then they changed their name, and then at this point in time, they deleted it. On Kwil, you can't see that. You can only see what is current, and if they've deleted it, then they're not there. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool. Okay.
totally. So you would be a really good tool for somebody who's interested in, let's say, like an issue like piracy, where if there isn't a record of it in Quill, but there is in Arweave of this movie, TV show, whatever, then the one that's in Quill is the legitimate one, maybe because you're filtering only for accounts that have been verified somehow or something like that.
Yeah. So I think so. I guess there is a. It's funny. So there is a way you can use Quill actually to provide like some different guarantees regarding like piracy for something like a movie. I would say though that you wouldn't store a movie in Quill, and so this is something that's sort of
Hmm.
like for relational databases. So on Arweave, you can store anything, right? You could store a
Mhm.
string of text, or you could store an entire movie that's several gigabytes in size, and it's really good at handling that. Quill is not good at handling those large pieces of data. And this gets down to like search algorithms and how we actually store that data in a database and search through all of them to retrieve the right one. It's very uncommon to store large, like gigabyte size amounts of data on Quill. But conceptually, what you're saying is correct. I guess that's just like the only other caveat that I would add.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. That might actually be a good kind of segue into the story of how you got to Quill, which I think is really interesting. I heard you tell it to another interviewer, so maybe you can just tell us a little bit about it again. Because you were working on, was it decentralized social,
Yeah.
and you were having trouble getting customers, and then like you had demand for what became Quill. So tell us more about that. How did that work?
Yeah. So, I told you I got into Web3 out of passion, and like out of alignment with the ethos. And so, what I like very specifically got into Web3 for was I was trying to build a platform where you could incentivize storing and serving of data anywhere on the planet permissionlessly and anonymously. So you could upload data to this platform, and there is an incentive for people to replicate that, but then give it to other people that want to read it. So, with the intent of in a country where they're censoring free speech and they're taking things off the internet, there's actually an incentive for people to not only store that, but also make it available for other people to go and read that data. Now, one, that is a really hard problem to solve, but two, it's even harder to build a business around that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we built a lot of infrastructure to try and solve that problem and build something that could do that. But we did really realize that we were not going to be able to create a sustainable business around that.
Yeah, it's
And
super hard.
yeah, extremely hard. But we did find that some of the problems we were solving on the data side were very valuable. And
Ah, okay.
we so yeah, that was kind of how Quill came about. It was actually completely an accident. It was actually completely an accident that we even chose relational databases to begin with. But yeah, it was people wanted to use the database platform. We sort of saw that we were not going to be able to create a viable sustainable economy and business around the social platform, and so we ended up running with what worked.
So what are some of your favorite dApps that incorporate Quill, and what do they do?
One that we're really excited about right now, they're called Fractal. For those that aren't aware, Fractal ID, it's a large decentralized identity protocol. I believe by user count, they are the largest. So Fractal, I mean, they can really do any type of credentials, but it seems like the sweet spot for them. And I don't want to be putting words in their mouth, but this is, at least in the context of Quill, this is true. They need to store data for KYC information, KYC
Oh,
and
wow.
AML. And the reason this is important is because it allows you to do things like under collateralized lending on chain. So right now, there are a lot of protocols that can do lending on chain, but it's all over collateralized. So if you want to take out a $10,000 loan, you need to put up $12,000 of some other thing. And
Mm-hmm.
sure, that's valuable and that's helpful. But it's a lot more helpful, like in the case of a bank, where you can put up $2,000 and they know who you are, and you have some sort of credit history, and you can now get $10,000 from that. That's much
Yeah.
more helpful for users. But a base requirement of that is that you need to be able to identify people, like identify literally who they are. There are some data privacy issues that come in there, and this is where we sort of get to what I was talking about earlier with the sliding scale, how often this is replicated, when it's replicated, and in this case, who can replicate it, and who can access it, therefore. But
So
I
it's
think,
permissioned somehow.
yeah, so
It
it is
yeah.
permission. This is a federated network. It would be
Yeah.
like, if you had data that was pertinent to, let's say it was like 5 different companies, and these companies are competitors, but for legal reasons, like who was hosting this data, and so you sort of hit that sweet spot of users of the platform. They have this guarantee by 5 companies that are competitors with each other, that they all have that data, but they also have legal guarantees that those companies are managing that data properly. And if they're not, governments literally know whose door to go knock on to say, hey, you need to start managing this better.
Got it.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, and so that's a use case we're really excited about because you know DeFi, it's all about having financial infrastructure without banks and institutions, and under collateralized lending without a bank is just such a crazy concept. But it's also very tangible.
It's an unworkable concept because you have no means for reputation.
But with a KYC and AML system, you do have a means
Mhm.
for replication, and
Mhm.
so that's really where the breakthrough is here.
Interesting. Do you happen to know if they're using the DIDS spec, the one that's been going through the standards process at the W3C for
I
their
believe so. I don't want to put words in their mouth, and
Okay.
but I, I do know that they are very concerned with like W3C. I don't know if compliance is the right word, but I know it's like a standard for accessing resources
Mhm.
online. And I
Good. I'm super happy to hear that. Because we need to come together around a set of standards or Web3 is not going to have the interoperability that we all like profess that it will. So
yeah,
that's really good to hear.
well, so
Excellent.
like I guess they probably are, because one of their biggest things on why they're building Kwil is so that even if their company ceases to exist, their identity standard will continue to exist.
Oh,
Companies that
cool.
are building on that identity standard or that are contributing to it will continue to exist because it's on Kwil and not on some database their company is running. And so I would
Mhm.
assume that they are probably conforming to that, but don't want to say for sure.
Good. Okay, awesome. In regards to the permissioned nature and how that connects with composability, once the use case has created a new database with its own schema, assuming that they do it with public storage enabled, um, is the structure of the data visible to others? Like if a music DApp creates a data structure, a data schema, could a competitor use that same schema so that they could essentially both expand their libraries that way or read from one another easily?
Yep, exactly. That It's very easy to see the schema of data, and actually, there's a tool for viewing schemas of data for publicly deployed databases. I mean, if you go to our website, it's called the Database Explorer. But yes, the whole point is that you can have shared data stores between competitors, so that the data store is no longer, and therefore the data within it is no longer owned by a company. It is a shared resource that other companies can come and congregate around and operate around.
Beautiful. How is that going? Are
Uh,
people willing to share and use others and have that interoperability?
so it's interesting. We sort of see, as with all things, it's a spectrum, but I think I can probably break it down into 3 different categories. And I think 2 of those 3 are particularly interesting for the sake of Quill. So the first one is totally permissionless. Totally open. They want people to come and build on top of this standard. They want the schema of their data to be a protocol, not something that's owned and mutable by their company. That is something that is common, but there are sort of some drawbacks with that, where a lot of businesses are built on data being valuable. And the only way that these businesses, or in some cases actually DAOs, the only way that they're able to be sustainable is if people are continuing to pay for the valuable data they create.
Mhm.
So that's sort of where we get into the second tranche, which is there are projects where they want their data to be public or at least permissionlessly accessible, but they
Mm-hmm.
do need to make sure that people are paying for it, because if not, then they won't exist. And then this data, the creation of this data, will no longer exist as well. And so that's
Okay.
sort of the second tranche. And I think I would probably group in with that ones that have some data security concerns, like a company like Fractal that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are people that they want to provide their users guarantees that they can access this data, but they also need certain rules on who can access it and how they can, or what they need to do to be able to access data. And then the third one is people that want a fully mutable structure. They want to fully own that data. For that, I don't think they should use Kwil. I don't know if they should use Web3, but they certainly should not be using Kwil. Um,
Sure.
but yeah, those are sort of the three different access paths that we have found. And we're sort of focusing on those first two.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Because the internet is the world's best copy machine, what are some of the things that you have in place for the second one to protect that data so that people can access it but not copy it, not share
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
It's a great question. So we sort of think of data access from two different verticals. So there's the data replication. So you can think of this like in a traditional blockchain. This is block mining. If I mined a block on Bitcoin, I have this data, and my goal is to spread this to the rest of the network because I get money for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is one way of replicating, or I guess accessing data from these databases, is just in like the replication. And the second one is in access, for like a external access. So, I mean, if you're familiar with like APIs, this would be something like an API, or it would be like a query. If you're familiar with SQL, it'd be a SQL query. Um, yeah, so we can sort of think of it in those two ways, because the first one, you get access to all of the data. And so we set a lot of restrictions around that, and those are configurable at the network level. So if you came and launched a database, you would be setting, okay, this is the ways in which all of the data can be replicated. This is who it can be replicated to. If somebody wants to come and say, hey, I want this, if a new node came online and said, I want you to replicate this data to my machine, there would be some sort of policy for whether or not that is applicable to them. And that is just generally like when you deploy your network, that like you choose that policy. The flip side of that, which is who can access specific bits of data. This is where Kwil has built something pretty interesting. We call it Cuneiform. So it's a language for designing database schemas, but then also how those schemas can be accessed. So you can set certain rules for what data, what pieces of data people can access, how they can access it, different access control rules, or things they have to do to access data. And I think a really interesting example of this is you can gate access to certain pieces of data behind a token. And some projects, they're trying to use this to, they have valuable data and they want to accrue the value of that data to on-chain assets. People have to
Mm-hmm.
use those on-chain assets to access the data. And so those are sort of the two different ways that we are thinking about data access control in permissioned but still Byzantine fault tolerant networks. So yeah, does that answer your question? I know that was very wordy
Mm-hmm.
and very long-winded.
No, I liked it. That was good. Thank you.
Cool.
So what are your thoughts about the future of Web3 and where, how we get from where we are to where we want to be?
Yeah, interesting. Uh, am I allowed to ask any like clarifying questions, or is there like a specific?
Of course.
I guess, is that intentionally open-ended?
Oh, yeah.
Or, okay.
Yeah, because there's this muddy sort of space where we are right now between, we're so entrenched in Web 2 that we release the show on YouTube. We promote it on Twitter. We're talking we're actually recording it on Zencaster, like you pointed out. Like we it, we're using all of Web 2's products promoting Web 3. And so right now, sometimes I feel like we're all just like having this like collective fever dream, like when do we eventually actually wake up, and when are we starting to like what's the journey, from where we are to where we want to be as an industry? What hurdles will we face? What victories might happen? Like, what are some milestones that you think of that like success will look like, or danger that we should look
Yeah.
out for?
So I think what is first most important is a collective understanding of why Web3, because I don't think Web3 will replace Web2. I think that Web2 is good at certain things, and Web3 platforms are good at certain things. but it is not a drop-in replacement. And so I don't think that, like, let's go back to the podcasting platform, for example. I don't actually, and I'm not saying this because I don't think so. I don't know if there's actually a need for a decentralized podcasting platform, because if Zencaster kicks you off, I'm sure there are Zencaster competitors. There's not a lot of risk to you using Zencaster, because once we are done with this hour long or however long it is podcast, I'm sure the data will be uploaded to Zencaster, but you can probably pull that down and use it, and you're not locked into the Zencaster platform. You could
Hmm.
go and
Hmm.
use, I think, like Riverside FM is maybe one of the other ones that's similar to Zencaster. There isn't a lot of platform lock on Zencaster. Um, and so I think one of the really interesting things about Web3 is that it prevents, or it protects against platform risk.
Hmm.
So what I just said about Zencaster is not quite as equally true on Twitter or Facebook. Those platforms have very strong network effects. You can't just leave and go onto another one, because you won't have the same social graph, you won't have the same social network. And so those
Right.
network effects, that's what's keeping users locked in, and that's what's allowing these platforms to abuse the rights of their customers. And
Hmm.
so I think a bit more broadly, what's important is that people understand why we need Web3 and in what cases we do not need Web3. And a bit more specifically, and this might be my perspective because I think this is somewhere where Kwil is particularly valuable, solving for platform risk issues that previously enabled the abuse of customers by larger corporations. Protecting against that with Web3 platforms is where Web3 really will be successful, because Web2 platforms literally cannot compete with that.
Yeah, that's a great
So
point.
that is, does that make sense? Is that what you were looking for in that,
Yeah,
or?
I think what's really interesting about that is that you're absolutely right. Like, you know, this is embarrassing, but I think my mom was still paying for her AOL email service until just a few years ago when she realized she didn't have to anymore. Like that's in some ways Web 1 lives on in that way. It's sort of weird. And so the idea that Web 2 will live on, I think you're absolutely right about, and that that the opportunity that we should be leaning into for success is in where Web 3 can offer solutions that Web 2 just can't compete with. I think that's absolutely right. I guess what I wonder, and I don't know if there even is an answer to this, is education. That's not going to be enough to move people to do the hard thing until the tech is easier to use, I think. Um, and at the point that it's easier to use, there will have been so many failed experiments that people will have platform fatigue. It's just something I sort of foresee as like a big danger for us, right? Because I already have it, Library just was sued by the SEC. They're supposed to be there forever, and you could argue that, yeah, the protocol still is, and da 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 da, but like this is software. Unless there's developers actively maintaining it, it becomes unusable. Bitcoin would fall under that same category. There's a team of developers that actively make sure Bitcoin continues to do its thing. It's an essential part of the picture. And so that's the part. Maybe you have an idea. If you do, I'd love to hear it, and if not, we can just keep going. But that's the part that I wonder how we're going to overcome is how or why will people be convinced that Web3 is what we promise it to be when there have been so many failed experiments? And what will make them, take that leap once we have kind of figured it out to the point where there's enough security that it's realistic to recommend it to your mom to get on?
Yeah. So I do have a couple thoughts on this, and
Okay.
I'm going to, I guess I'll give two disclaimers here. One, this is a paraphrase, and two, which I guess is implied with a paraphrase, these are not my original thoughts. This is sort of me applying something that has been known for a while to the specific case of Web3. And so just very basically, whether or not Web3 exists, it'll be because Web3 products exist. Web3 products, for some reason, people choose to use those over Web2 products. And for quite a while now, I don't know how long, but certainly longer than I've been alive, there's been a theory for the basis of competition for products. Why does somebody choose to use one product over another? And there's four criteria in order. The first one is functionality. The second one is scalability. The third one is convenience. And the fourth one is cost.
Okay.
So I think Web3 is still pretty solidly in the first one. If people want to use Web3, I mean, for one, it can't compete on a cost basis, but it's not going to be because it's just totally more convenient than Web2. Um, well, kind of an asterisk there. I'll come back to that. It probably will not be because it's simply more convenient or it is more scalable than Web 2. It will probably have something to do with functionality. And this actually ties back to why I was talking about platform risk. That is a very concrete type of functionality that Web3 platforms win on, that they are able to compete and win against Web 2 platforms on. And so I think first and foremost, we need a specific type of functionality that people want and that Web3 does better. Now, there are sort of some thoughts on this because that's not a like totally true statement. The general thought process is that if you can get either a 90% price decrease or a 10x speed increase, then that actually qualifies as its own piece of functionality, and that then becomes a first class basis of competition. And so we either need some very specific type of functionality or very radical increases in UX or speed and price,
Uh-huh.
which Web3 is actually particularly bad at. And so I think first and foremost, we need the better functionality. And like because I think a lot of Web3 projects, they incorrectly focus on price, UX, and speed when that is really not the basis for competition right now. People will use Web3 in spite of those being bad because it can do something else. And so I really think that's what Web3 platforms need to be focused on solving. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I
Cool.
love that answer.
Awesome.
Yeah. Compete where you can win. That sounds good to me. All right. Well, is there anything else that you want to share about Kwil aside from I think you have a mainnet launching in 2024?
Yeah. I mean, the concept of a mainnet on Quill is interesting because there isn't a single homogeneous network. Anyone can use Quill right now, but I think there's some pretty major upgrades actually coming in the next few weeks, but
Ooh.
it'll be continually occurring over the course of the next at least year, like very, very major groundbreaking upgrades. And I'll just leave it intentionally vague at that.
Okay. All right. Well, then everybody out there, go check it out. All right. Second to last question. Do you have a message for legislators or regulators? Like, if there's one thing that you wanted them to know about what we need to have Web3, stay here in America and thrive, do you have any sort of message for them?
I'm really not like a legal policy guy. I really am a technology guy. I'm honestly, this might not be the best message. So if there are any regulators out there, maybe listen to some of the other podcasts for some more hard hitting ones. But I want this to exist. I want digital public infrastructure to exist. I hope that will be in America where I do that. But if it's not, then I'll go somewhere where I can build that. I think this is something just having grown up with the internet and now spending potentially the majority of my time on the internet or on things that are dependent on the internet. I think it's pretty critically important that we solve this. And so I think I will do what it takes to make that happen. I just hope that's in America, but uh, I guess it's sort of up to them if that will be in America.
Perfect answer.
Cool.
So
Thank
true. I think it's really, really powerful to hear it from a builder's perspective. That way, we've been saying that, but you're the first one that's just like said it on camera, I guess. So, yeah, it's a very serious danger I think that faces us right now. Final question: what kind of internet do you want?
I want an internet that guarantees the same rights that made Western society great. The reason why America as a concept, but then I think the rights that were guaranteed by America have spread more broadly to Western society. Those were like a very foundational shift in quality of life, and yeah, I mean, I would say quality of life for individuals. As our lives are going online more, I think it's important that we bring those rights online. And so I want an internet that guarantees those rights.
Well, Brennan, it has been a pleasure to speak with you. I want the same kind of internet. I can tell that you are a builder that has a deep heart for the good that this technology can bring to the world. And I thank you for the work that you're providing
Yeah. Thank you
to
so much
that
for having me.
effort. Have a good one. Thank you so much.
Yeah. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.